With our own troops involved, Canadians are more concerned about the situation in Afghanistan than ever before. It is under this light that I had a look at a very detailed and well-researched book titled Invisible History: Afghanistan's Untold Story. The authors of the book are Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould, who have been a husband and wife team since 1977. In 1981, they were the first American journalists permitted to enter Afghanistan behind Soviet lines. They covered the war first for CBS News, they produced a documentary for PBS, as well as working with ABC's Nightline in 1983. They also co-produced the 2003 documentary, The Woman in Exile Returns, the Seema Wall Story. I had the chance to ask them a few questions about their new book, and I've prepared a couple of excerpts for you. Yes, I was wondering if you could tell our listeners what motivated you to write this book.
We wrote our book, Invisible History: Afghanistan's Untold Story, primarily to try to address the fundamental lack of basic understanding of how intimately involved the United States government was in actively drawing the Soviets into Afghanistan, starting in the late 1970s, and then throughout the 1980s, providing a tremendous resource which really was not being covered by the American media. So you have really two levels of reason why the American people are literally at a loss for understanding, and certainly I'm sure many other people too, but obviously this is an American issue because these were American policies.
Once again, even the Soviet involvement in Afghanistan, as we know now, and has been documented by Secretary of State Robert Gates and former National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, the Soviets were lured into Afghanistan in order to give them their own Vietnam. That was a policy. After Vietnam ended in 1975, there was an effort on behalf of a certain group in the United States, politically influential group, to lure the Soviets into a similar kind of trap and do the same thing for them that the communists had done to the United States in Vietnam.
There's also another a piece of our experience. In 1983, when we went into Afghanistan with Roger Fisher from the Harvard Negotiation Project to assess the possibility of negotiating the Soviets out for Nightline, we basically discovered the Soviets were desperate to get out and requested that Roger pass the information on to the powers that be, that given 6 months of stability, meaning that the insurgency should be basically cut back from Pakistan, that the Soviets were willing to withdraw from Afghanistan. And what we discovered when we came back with that story, neither Nightline nor the American government had any interest in pursuing that option. I think it is part of our purpose in writing this book was to lay absolutely bare, any illusion that the United States is not directly responsible for the crisis today, but how the United States should now address that responsibility. We have a lot of problems with the way we're addressing it, absolutely.
Another thing that I found particularly informative was your description of the Taliban as being a non-indigenous force. Can you please elaborate on that?
Our Afghan friends have told us in no uncertain terms that they feel the Taliban is an alien force. That basically the Afghan people have been kidnapped by an alien force, and that under the most extreme circumstances of survival, they have in fact been forced at times to have to work with them. And then that is used as a way to rationalize the idea. And also the fact that there is a level, but it is a lower level of the Taliban. The Afghan Taliban, the ones who were recruited from the refugee camps and did turn into Taliban, are not really the power behind the Taliban. So that was used as a way to give an impression that it was indigenous.
What I'd like to say is that the Taliban appeared on the scene appeared to be an indigenous group of people. In truth, they really were not indigenous. The only thing that they had connected with Afghanistan was the fact that these were young boys who had been recruited from madrasas in Pakistan in refugee camps during that time period. And as a result of that, they're ethnically Pashtun. They were disenfranchised from their homeland. They were not enculturated into Afghan culture or society. They were essentially Pakistanis who were recruited by extremists in Pakistan's ISI, its Directorate of Intelligence, in order to carry forward Pakistan's forward policy into Afghanistan, which essentially the objective of which had been going on since 1973. So really, the whole idea, this whole idea that they were somehow some kind of indigenous purifying force for Afghanistan was really a public relations campaign.
Looking forward, are there any comments that you would have or that you think that our listeners should hear?
Well, I think there is definitely a need for the United States to recognize that this is a regional problem, and the United States should play a very positive role in assisting the region, which would include Pakistan and India, and it would include Russia, and it would include China. These are all the neighbors around this area. This has to be viewed from in terms of assisting in the process of bringing a kind of, again, a civil discussion, recognizing the regional interests that have to all be accounted for. And then we might begin to come up with real ideas that would actually be accepted by the Afghan people, because they would be in charge of their own destiny.
We always felt that the story of Afghanistan was more a story of Washington than it was a story about what was going on in Kabul. And that still is the case today. Here we've been there, involved directly for the last 7 years, and almost 8 years at this point. And what has happened? How has it been done? Has the United States adjusted its thinking or adjusted its application in terms of its aid, in terms of its military approach, in order to deal with what it's facing there? No, it's not. It hasn't. Whether the Obama administration can do that, everyone is hoping that there can be some kind of adjustments that will provide at least enough security so that some of the basic services for civil society can be redone. And I'd also like to say that we want to thank our publisher, City Lights, who for years we've been out there with this story, trying to get this idea across. And things have been, we've had a lot of changes here in the United States in terms of the monopolization of media. It's shrunk to a very small core of very large-scale outlets that simply do not help the smaller stories get out. And this is a story that could have gotten out 20 years ago. A lot of the things that have happened in Afghanistan would never have happened, but they've just simply been overlooked by the major media. So, we want to thank all those small publishers out there like City Lights who are doing the kind of grunt work that needs to be done to help people understand what needs to be understood right now.
That was Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould, authors of a new book titled Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story, which I would recommend to anyone who wants to know more about the recent and troubled history of Afghanistan.